To kick off this canning adventure, I soaked 2.5 cups of dried black beans in water overnight. While it's possible to can beans without soaking, I've read that this step helps reduce certain acids in legumes that can hinder iron absorption. The next day, I drained and rinsed the beans thoroughly before tossing them in a pot. I filled the pot with fresh water until it just covered the beans and set it to simmer for 30 minutes. While the beans were cooking, I turned my attention to the jars, washing them with warm, soapy water and prepping my electric canner by adding the 8 cups of water it requires. Time to fill the jars. I grabbed warm pint jars and evenly divided the beans between them, and leaving a generous inch of headspace. I needed to improve my pressure canning skills because I tried to make a batch of homemade tomato soup using garden frozen tomatoes, but I ended up with a mess of siphoning liquid that cost me half the soup. I have big plans to grow 650 pounds of vegetables this year. Pressure canning is one of the techniques I plan to use to preserve it for winter use. But because I don't want to waste much of my homegrown produce in the pressure canning process, I've decided to practice with something a little less precious: store-bought black beans. Carefully checking for any air pockets trapped between the beans, I added more water when necessary to maintain the vital headspace. I wiped the rims of the jars with a clean paper towel soaked in vinegar. With everything set, I placed the lids on, tightening them just enough to apply fingertip pressure. After carefully filling the jars with beans, I placed them inside the pressure canner, sealing and locking the lid. With a few taps on the control panel, I selected the high pressure option, then pressed the time button, setting it to 75 minutes for my pint-sized jars. I adjusted the pressure limiting valve to exhaust and pressed start, watching as the screen began to rotate, signaling the beginning of the canning process. As the canner worked its magic, steam started to vent through the pressure valve, a reassuring sign that everything was on track. Once the canner reached the optimal internal temperature, it beeped, and the control panel displayed E10, indicating that it would vent for the next 10 minutes. When the display turned to E0, the canner beeped again, my signal to move to the next step. I swiftly set the valve to airtight, and the countdown for the 75-minute processing time began. After what felt like an eternity, the canning process was complete. I let the pressure release naturally for an hour. I opened the canner to inspect the jars. I noticed some siphoning had occurred. While the jars had sealed, I had lost half an inch of liquid. Determined to improve my technique, I decided to try again. This time, I carefully divided the beans among 5 jars, ensuring they had ample room to expand. I topped the jars off with some water and left an inch of headspace. But when I opened the canner for the second time, I still had siphoning happen. After letting the jars rest for 12 hours, 2 of the jars failed to seal. I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little discouraged. Maybe I need a larger headspace. I'm letting the canner depressurize naturally over at least an hour. If you know why I'm having issues with siphoning in my pressure canner, please let me know in the comments. I'm going to do some research and then I'll try again in a couple weeks.